So who are the Palestinians? And who said in the final analysis that Arafat represents them, just because he makes this claim? Just because he terrorizes all the others and they don't dare speak up their mind? Just because he's an extremist? We live with them. We played with them as children. We're not enemies. We know exactly their line of thinking. That's how we can negotiate. That's how we can fight.
When Israel returned the Sinai to Egypt under the Camp David peace accords, they basically went from a position of oil independence to a position of oil dependence. Gasoline is very expensive in Israel. It costs about $2 a gallon. I had the opportunity to interview Yitzchak Modai, Minister of Energy and Infrastructure for the State of Israel, and he explained in graphic terms the great sacrifice that returning the Sinai was, forgetting for the moment about the dismantling of settlements and the doing away with all the air bases and the sophisticated military installations. Strictly from the standpoint of energy, oil, the sacrifice was a great one on the part of the people of Israel. He is hoping that through Israel's own technology, they can develop independent sources of oil, but as yet, Israel has not yet found a sufficient source of oil to make it another Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. Interestingly, although Modai is a minister in the government of Menachem Begin, he is not even a member of Begin's party. He is a member of the Liberal Party, and that's how the coalition system works within the State of Israel, where a party having only 4 or 5 seats in the Knesset can get one of its major members to be a minister within the government. And trying to draw a comparison between the ministers of the Israeli government to the cabinet members of the United States government, it's really completely different, because our president has total control over his cabinet members, can fire them at will, and of course they do not sit in the Congress of the United States, whereas Modai, Ne'eman, and other ministers who I've interviewed actually are members of the Knesset. So they have both legislative and executive roles, which is obviously different from the clear separation of powers in the United States between executive, legislative, and judicial. Although Modai is a member of the Liberal Party, philosophically and politically he is extremely conservative, and looking into the same camera that I'm looking into, he told an American audience, mincing no words whatever, that he is not willing to give back 1 inch of the West Bank, Judea or Samaria.
Mr. Modai, doesn't the American administration have reason to believe that Israel will again give in to U.S. pressure on the West Bank? Look at the concessions Kissinger extracted after the Yom Kippur War. Also, the huge Camp David concessions. Even the troop withdrawal agreement with Lebanon. Don't you honestly believe that the Reagan plan, or at least something very close to it, will eventually be accepted by Israel?
The only question is whether they are judging rightly by whom they can pressurize in order to accomplish something. I'm afraid that this time the administration is wrong. We would want to see King Hussein in the discussions. We would want to see the Palestinians in the discussions, but with the very specific defined goal to set up a full autonomy for the Palestinians in the West Bank. Nothing less, nothing more. This was agreed upon. Now, if the United States tries to apply pressure, they can, they certainly may, and I'm afraid it won't work. I'm happy to say it won't work. It's come to the point where we cannot give up anymore. And the former examples do not hold, as I explained in retreating from the Sinai Peninsula. The 56 war in the Sinai had nothing to do with it. It was not an Israeli war. It was a combined British, and Israeli, where the Americans were opposed to and the Russians were opposed to. Now, entrance into Lebanon was supported by America. Not in so many words, but now they come out. Even recently, the administration said that Mr. Begin has misled them. He said he'll only advance 45 kilometers. Up to 45 kilometers.
Well, what's the story on that? Yeah, because that was widely misunderstood in the United States.
The story is very simple. We do not really take orders from the United States of America. Now, this is clear. I don't want to use strong terms, but the United States of America is not the party that is responsible for our lives. We have to cater for that. We had a PLO state in Lebanon. This was not Lebanon. This was a state within a state, bombarding Israel continuously, controlling and directing all these terrorist activities throughout the state of Israel and, as a matter of fact, throughout the world. I mean, what were we expected to do? To sit back?
But why say we were just going to
We
go?
never said that. We had a resolution that night, the 5th of June, I remember it vividly. And I'm a member of cabinet. The issue was brought up. The decision was made that same night. We said the first goal is clear them out beyond the range of mortars and Katyushas so that they can't hit any longer Israeli settlements and cities and villages along the borders and deep into the country. Now, when we reach the 40 or 45 kilometers and we see that they are stretching way beyond it with all their fortresses, with all their forces, with all their equipment, with all their men, I mean, what is one to do? To stop there because you've reached the 40 kilometers? It's ridiculous. The target, the clear target, was to destroy and destruct as much as possible the backbone of the terrorist movements. That we have done. And if not for external intervention, we would have done it much thorougher. And I'm referring now to West Beirut.
Immediate attention.
Yeah, unfortunately, there was an intervention and from without. And when all is said and done, we are a small nation. We are a small people. We know our limitations. And there is a point where we have to go along. Now, in Beirut, we could afford it. In Lebanon, close to our borders, we cannot afford it. In Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, it's completely out of question. I don't think it's worth the effort, even the try. It will only bring about bad blood.
So you think that the peacekeeping force, the so-called peacekeeping force that came in, American Marines and the Italians and the French, were actually a detriment in terms of enabling Israel to wipe out the PLO? It really served to help the PLO.
That's the final outcome, but I have to remind our listeners that the same forces came in once and then evacuated, and they came back. I mean, I can blame the tragedy that transpired as much upon those forces as upon the forces of the Israeli Defense Force. I mean, they were in. And if there was a dangerous situation, why have they evacuated? Nobody invited them in. Nobody asked them to leave.
Well, I've heard many Americans say, in fact, Americans who I know who were former members of the United States Marines, which has a great history that people are very proud of in the States, that they were, to a certain extent, ashamed of the U.S. Marine role in Lebanon, because you had all those guys coming in with their sleeves rolled up and big bulging muscles, and it seemed as though their mission was to protect the PLO as they left Lebanon.
And once the PLO was out of Lebanon, the U.S. Marines left, and then, as you described, the situation occurred where Israel was back on the line, the peacekeeping forces were out, and then the phalangists went into the refugee camps.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it is very unfortunate. Until that point, everything developed along the lines that I'm sure all the Americans would have been happy with the outcome. Because before the President-elect Bashir Jumayel was murdered, we had a full understanding with him. By now, we would have a peace treaty between Israel and Lebanon. And followed by the unfortunate massacre at Sabra and Shatila, we reached a position that we could not continue against public opinion, which came out so strong against the state of Israel, as if Israeli troops, God forbid, have performed a massacre. We had to accept that being in the area will not be accepted by world public opinion. And it was not for the state of Israel such a crucial issue that it was worthwhile to entangle with the American administration, with world opinion. We left it, but it will hit back not necessarily against the state of Israel. If terrorist gangs gather together again, they have targets all over the world, and I don't have to tell you. They hit wherever it's convenient for them. Now, if somebody doesn't go along with them, they hit hard. Sometimes economically, that's what they're doing plenty in the United States. Even if you people are not aware of it. They buy out media like crazy. They brainwash the public in many respects.
Can you be a little specific on that? What do you mean
cannot,
about
unfortunately.
The terrorists buy out media?
I don't say that. I say
in the United
oil
States?
countries buy out media, media. Plenty.
So you ascribe a lot of the negative media in the United States toward Israel to having been bought out by oil countries?
At least some. And professional people know it.
Unless there is an Israeli presence, and a fairly significant Israeli presence in Lebanon, how is any Lebanese government within the foreseeable future going to be able to assure you of what you need? The safety of the northern Galilee, the safety of Israel.
Actually, I could refer this question back to the American administration. How would they suggest that our security is secured from Lebanon? Now, the way we look upon it is certain circumstances have to come about. Number one is all forces have to evacuate in the first place the terrorist gangs, the PLO. And that's the first condition. Otherwise, they take over Lebanon in no time, as they have done before. Of course, the Syrian forces, if we have no business to be there, and we admit we have no business to be in Lebanon, neither do they. So they will have to retreat. Then it is understandable that we will have to have certain alarming positions within Lebanon so that we can know what's happening in the area. We've flown over Lebanon all the time, as a matter of fact, even before, since the Syrian invasion, to know what's happening. That's how we knew where the PLO position were, where the schools were, training grounds, etc. Now, there will have to be made some arrangements that we can know what's happening there. As you said, we cannot rely at this stage upon the Lebanese. Maybe it will have to be limited until the Lebanese can take over and protect our flank by their forces. That's acceptable by us, as long as they can guarantee it. We only pray and hope that they'll never call to us for help when they fight among themselves. But we do not have any claims, neither to Lebanese territory, nor to the Lebanese people. We have one claim in the entire issue of the Middle East, and I want to repeat it. Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip are part and parcel. The Arabs, the Palestinians have a right. It's an unfortunate development in history. Two people have a claim to the same piece of land. It's very unfortunate, but it's a fact. Now they can have the land, the security we will have to have. They can run their lives as much as they want and as freely as they want. They will have the highest standard of living among all the Arabs living in the Middle East. like the Palestinians Arab have, more than the Saudis, with all the oil, all the wealth. Standard of living here is higher, because they've learned, together with us, how to work, how to produce. Now, why should the administration go along with the desert rather than going along with progress? That's beyond me.
How do you mean go along with the desert?
Desert is what the Arabs have made of their countries. Progress is what we have made of a desert.
Well, it's extraordinary in a way how the words, which are really intangibles, become stumbling blocks. I mean, you say autonomy as though autonomy is a really clear-cut, definable term. I think I understand what your meaning of it is, and then we get hung up over terms like sovereignty. Now, although you're willing to give the Arabs, the Palestinians that live in the West Bank, autonomy, you are absolutely unwilling to give them sovereignty. You insist upon Israeli sovereignty over that entire region.
That's not the case. That is not the case at all. If we would claim sovereignty, we would have imposed it, as we've done with the Golan Heights, right away.
You're not talking about annexing.
I am not talking about annexing. I'm talking about security control, which is necessary for the security of the State of Israel because of their geographic and topographic positions. Unfortunately, but this is the case. We're not talking about annexing. We're not talking about controlling the way of life. Full autonomy is a term that was invented by President Carter. And it's clearly defined. Israel will have security control. The Palestinians will have the control over the civilian lives to the widest possible extent, whatever they choose to have. They can even be citizens of Jordan if they wish, whatever they want.
As the citizens, as the Arabs of East Jerusalem are given that option.
Yes, whichever way they want it. Now, let's analyze for a minute who are the Palestinians in the way that they think of it. Now, there are less than 3 million Palestinians now in the Middle East, in the world, as a matter of fact. Now, over 1 million, 1.2 million, have their home. They are citizens of Transjordan. They have had a prime minister there twice. They have members of cabinet, whoever. Now, 750,000 are Israeli citizens. Well, they live in Israel. About 350,000 are in Lebanon. About 200,000 are in Syria and some other Arab countries. And you've got less than 1 million in Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. Now, who are really the Palestinians? If they are not a national entity, they're just Arabs, then they have 21 states of their own. If they have a national entity, what about all those that are Palestinians by definition and are in neighboring countries and do not have a claim for statehood at all, because they have the statehood? So who are the Palestinians? And who said in the final analysis that Arafat represents them just because he makes this claim? Just because he terrorizes all the others and they don't dare speak up their mind? Just because he's an extremist? One thing, some credit you have to give us, and that is understanding the area and its people slightly better than those who live so far away. We live with them. We played with them as children. We're not enemies. We know exactly the line of thinking. That's how we can negotiate. That's how we can fight. We know exactly. How do you think do we do it? A tiny little nation like ours, holding out 35 years, 5 bloody wars, as against millions surrounding us, with military forces 10 times our size, 20 times our size, with such a world of wealth. How can we possibly hold out? Because we understand, we know, they cannot get together, because the world talks about Arabs, and we know the difference between them. If need be, look at Lebanon. Lebanon is called a state. No one quarter can get along with another quarter. No way. When it comes to the state of Israel, they are united. That's right, to destroy the state of Israel. That you would appreciate, we can't accept. That you would appreciate, we have to fight. And I do hope and believe that even without a change of administration,
in Israel?
In the United States.
In the United States, okay, I wanted to be sure.
Eventually, they will come to understand that the American and free world problems in this area cannot all be solved on the expense of the tiny little state of Israel. There is no way to solve them. There are much bigger ones.
So you certainly expressed yourself in a very, very articulate way that the bottom line problem, as you see it, is certainly not Lebanon, but the West Bank. Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza.
That is correct, sir.
And I think that you have performed a very valuable service by telling the American people in a very forthright way, rather than, as so many other Israelis do, kind of leading them to believe we'll make a concession here, we'll make a little concession there on Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Because as I understand your position, you're not giving 1 inch of it over to Arab sovereignty. You're willing to have very generous autonomy arrangements, but with the state of Israel having all the powers of security and all the military powers in that area.
That is right, and all that along with the only possible interpretation of the Camp David Accord, on which an American president, ex-president, is a signatory on behalf of the American people. It is very difficult to analyze now the various interpretations, but fortunately enough, the document is still available, and everybody can read it. Why should American citizens understand Camp David Accords through the interpretation of President Carter, or the ex-President Carter, or the President's administration?
It's only a few pages.
Why can't they read them? Would they please read them? Make up their own mind of what the exact interpretation could possibly have been. I mean, even a child can read it. It's in clear language. It has some contradictory statements. It does have, as every political document has. It has some obscure mentions here and there, but on the whole, I mean, how there could not possibly be a claim to a Palestinian state, to Palestinian sovereignty? We know this terminology. It was not used there. It was, not only wasn't it used, it was claimed and rejected. And when all was over, President Sadat wrote a letter to President Carter, which President Carter has acknowledged, that after the 5 years of full autonomy, he will feel free to make the claim for a free sovereign Palestinian state. At which point, Prime Minister Begin wrote to President Carter, and this was acknowledged, that if there is a claim made for a Palestinian independent state within Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, Israel will have a claim for sovereignty over these territories. But it is certainly not an immediate Palestinian state. It is certainly not an agreement that after 5 years there will be a Palestinian state. This was left open, and I'll tell you why we agreed to leave it open. Because we did believe, and we still do believe, that if the extreme forces, Palestinian terrorists, are excluded from among the Palestinian population, and they do have their full autonomy, and they do run their own lives, and they will by themselves learn and come to the conclusion that Israel does not want to pressurize them in any respect whatsoever, that we will honor their freedom to run themselves, and eventually they themselves will choose to stay and go on with the same arrangement that we have originally proposed. The trouble is that when you come to the implementation, it is the foreign forces who intervene. For instance, American administration, and do not let you to come to the point, even to the initial point, of establishing the administrative council, of setting up the full autonomy. I mean, that nobody denies was part and parcel of the agreement. Why not set it up?
America's been an impediment in terms of getting that established?
Well, by taking sides and by suggesting a new plan, which came as new lines of thought from President Carter. I mean, what Palestinian Arab idiot would want to discuss with us a full autonomy when President Reagan himself tells him that he wants to shorten the period, that he sees that there should be a Palestinian state? Why go through this passage? Why not have immediately a Palestinian state?
Do you interpret the Reagan plan as calling for a Palestinian state, or are you saying that when he talks about self-government and association with Jordan, it will definitely lead to a Palestinian state?
What else does it mean? What else does it mean? And do I care whether it's associated with Jordan or not associated with Jordan? What difference does it make for me? Is Jordan more secure for the state of Israel? King Hussein has not sent his troops into Israel? And his grandfather Abdullah has not sent his forces into Israel, trying to wipe out the Jewish population here? And what's the big deal about having King Hussein next to us? He certainly cannot have any claim to Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. But to go out of my way to ask King Hussein, what will he bring? Oil, wealth, military force, political influence? I mean, what does he have to offer?
You tell me, what does he have to offer? You're apparently saying nothing.
Number two state that will sign a peace treaty with Israel and topple the balance between those Arab countries who do not wish to see Israel exist and those who have come to the conclusion that Israel is a fact and they have to learn to live with it.
You'd basically like America to get off Israel's back in terms of pressure to make concessions on Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, because you've told the American public there is no more room for any concessions.
That is correct, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.